My name's Sophia, and the countryside always seemed like the perfect escape. The open fields, the fresh air, and the quiet were all I craved after months of city noise. That's why I didn't think twice when my parents suggested I house sit for my uncle. His property was miles from the nearest neighbor, perched on the edge of a sprawling field with a dense forest behind it. I arrived on a sunny Friday morning, my car kicking up dust on the long gravel driveway. The house was modest but cozy, with a wraparound porch and big windows overlooking the endless stretch of field. I felt like I'd stepped into another world, one where time slowed down. After unpacking and getting settled, I made myself some tea and sat on the porch. The silence was both comforting and eerie. Out here, there were no traffic noises, no voices, just the faint rustle of wind through the tall grass. That evening, I decided to go for a walk. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the field, and the air was crisp. I followed a narrow dirt path that cut through the tall grass, leading toward the edge of the forest. As I walked, I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. The vastness of the field made me feel exposed, like someone could be watching me from anywhere. When I reached the forest edge, I paused. The trees were dense, their branches twisting into dark shapes as the sunlight faded. I considered going in but decided against it. Something about the shadows felt off. I turned back toward the house, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought I was just tripping. Was that a shadowy figure way out at the edge of the field, barely peeking through the grass? But then I squinted and, oh no. That was a whole dude, or maybe some older guy, couldn't tell. But the man was straight up sprinting, like full-on charging right at me. My heart shot straight into my throat. I was stuck, frozen in place, like, what even is happening right now? Who is this guy? Why is he running? Hello? I called out, my voice all shaky and unsure. He didn't respond. He just kept running, his figure growing larger and more distinct with each passing second. Panic set in. I turned and sprinted back toward the house, the tall grass whipping against my legs. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him, the heavy thud of his footsteps gaining on me. By the time I reached the porch, I was gasping for air. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands trembling. Through the window, I scanned the field, but he was gone. The field was empty, stretching out under the dim glow of the moon. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it, if the isolation had played tricks on my mind, but the fear in my chest told me otherwise. I closed all the curtains, triple-checked the locks, and turned on every light in the house. Still, the silence pressed in on me, heavier now. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it. There was this faint tick, tick, tick on the window. I froze, my heart thundering so loud it felt like it was echoing in my head. The sound came again, steady, almost like it was on purpose. Slowly, I inched toward the window, my breath coming in quick, shaky little gasps. When I pulled back the curtain, my stomach hit the floor. He was right there, just a few feet away, staring straight at me through the glass. His face was completely blank, no emotion at all, but his eyes, they locked onto mine like lasers, and it felt like they were looking straight through me. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the silence. I ran to the front window and saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling up the driveway. By the time the officers searched the property, the man was gone. They found footprints in the dirt near the back door and along the edge of the field, but they led nowhere. Probably a drifter, one of the officers said, trying to reassure me. Might have been looking for an easy target. You did the right thing calling us. I nodded, but their words didn't bring much comfort. I left the house the next morning, cutting my stay short. At that point, I didn't give a fuck about the peaceful countryside anymore. All I could think about was the man in the field, the way he ran towards me like someone on some hard drugs, and the way he stared through the window at me with those empty eyes. I'm a 22-year-old woman, and my best friend Mia and I had been planning our hiking trip for weeks. We were tired of the monotony of our college lives and wanted a real adventure, a weekend away from the world. Mia found an obscure listing online for a secluded cabin near the base of a popular hiking trail. It was ideal, cheap, remote, and surrounded by nature. We hit the road hella early on a Saturday morning, Mia behind the wheel and me playing co-pilot. The road trip was a blast at first, windows down, bangers blasting, snacks getting annihilated. But the vibe? Oh, it started feeling off the closer we got. The last hour of the drive was on a narrow dirt road winding through thick, towering trees. The GPS cut out halfway there, leaving us to rely on Mia's printed directions. By the time we reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place was tiny, tucked into the edge of the forest, with a weathered exterior and an old sagging porch. It looked like no one had stayed there in years. Charming! Mia joked, though I could tell she was a little unsettled. Inside, the cabin was basic, just a single room with a small kitchenette, a table, and a couple of bunk beds pushed against the walls. There was no electricity, just a propane lantern and a wood-burning stove. A small note on the table from the owner said the area had no cell service. "Guess we're really unplugged now," Mia said. We spent the evening settling in, unpacking, and cooking a quick meal over the stove. As the sun set, the forest around us turned pitch black. The silence was almost oppressive. No cars, no distant voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After dinner, we decided to explore the trailhead near the cabin before it got too late. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the woods. The trail was overgrown, winding between trees so tall they seemed to block out the sky. It felt like the forest was pressing in on us, the shadows growing deeper with every step. About 10 minutes in, we noticed something strange. An old rusted bike leaning against a tree. It was completely overgrown with vines, like it had been abandoned there for years. "That's weird, Mum," Mia said, snapping a picture. "Maybe someone ditched it." We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The trail felt endless, and every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. Eventually, we decided to turn back. The thought of the cabin's warm stove was far more appealing than the eerie forest. When we reached the cabin, we locked the door behind us and lit the lantern. I tried to shake off my nerves as we played cards on the small table, but the stillness outside was unnerving. Around 11 p.m., Mia decided to step outside to use the bathroom. There was no indoor plumbing, just an outhouse a few yards away. I stayed inside, tidying up and trying not to think about how isolated we were. A few minutes later, Mia came back inside, her face pale. "What's wrong, Anna?" I asked. "I think someone's out there," she whispered. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I heard footsteps," she said, her voice shaky. They were slow, deliberate. I'm damn sure it wasn't an animal. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously peeked out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. "There's no one, Mia," I said, trying to sound confident, though my heart was racing. We locked the door and double-checked the windows before sitting back down. The unease was palpable, and every little noise outside made us jump. Then we heard it, soft footsteps crunching in the dirt outside. Mia and I froze, staring at each other. The sound circled the cabin, slow and methodical. My chest tightened again with every step. "Who's out there?" Mia called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then a man's voice called back, low and even. "Just passing through." It didn't sound right. His tone was too calm, too deliberate, like he was trying to sound harmless. "All right, keep moving then," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps resumed, but instead of fading into the distance, they stopped directly outside the front door. "Open up," the man said. Mia grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "What do we do?" she whispered. I shook my head, my mind racing. "Stay quiet." The door rattled, the knob turning slowly. Thank God we had locked it. The man didn't say anything else. Instead, he began walking around the cabin again, the sound of his footsteps circling us like a predator. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, my hands trembling. We turned off the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness, hoping he'd think we weren't inside anymore. For a while, everything was silent. Then the footsteps stopped, and the man spoke again, this time right outside the window. "Nice place you've got here, girls." The sound of his voice was so close, it sent chills all over. I held my breath, gripping the poker tighter. Then, without warning, the window shattered. Glass rained down as Mia and I screamed. The man's arm reached inside, groping for the latch. Without thinking, I swung the poker, slamming it against his arm. He yelped in pain and retreated, his footsteps pounding away into the forest. We didn't wait to see if he'd come back. Grabbing only our flashlights and car keys, we bolted out the door and ran for the car. The forest felt alive with shadows, every sound making us flinch. We sped down the dirt road, not stopping until we reached the nearest gas station miles away. We called the police, but when they checked the cabin, there was no sign of the man, just the shattered window and footprints circling the building. Honestly, to this day, I've got no clue who that guy was or what he even wanted. I watch true crime and scary stuff all the time, but nobody ever really gives you solid advice after those videos. So if you're out and about, girl, stay alert and keep your head on a swivel. I've been working as a wildlife researcher for nearly a decade, and I've grown used to the solitude that comes with the job. Being alone in remote areas, documenting wildlife patterns, and observing nature's raw beauty, it's what I live for. There's a peace to it, a kind of rhythmic quiet that seeps into your bones. But my last assignment in the Utah canyons was different. It was the kind of experience that shakes the foundation of what you think you know about the world. It left me questioning if I'd ever go out there alone again. It was late September when I was sent to survey wildlife in a remote canyon area about 80 miles from the nearest town. The place was known for its rugged terrain, dry riverbeds, and towering cliffs that cast long shadows across the desert floor. Beautiful, yes, but unforgiving. Even during the day, the air was still and heavy, like the land was holding its breath. The drive out was uneventful at first, just the usual endless stretches of dirt roads, the occasional tumbleweed, and the mesmerizing expanse of red and orange rock formations that seemed to stretch forever. By the time I reached the base camp location, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple. That kind of beauty felt almost unreal, like stepping into a painting. Yet as the shadows grew longer and the vibrant hues faded to deeper blues, I felt the first tendrils of unease coil around me. It wasn't anything I could put into words, just the weight of isolation pressing a little harder than usual. I set up my tent near a dried-up riverbed, unpacked my gear, and prepared for the next day's work. The air was cool, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation. Nights in places like this can be eerie. The absence of sound feels loud, if that makes sense. But I'd been here before, in similar places, and I knew the drill. Focus on the work, ignore the nerves. The first day went smoothly enough. I hiked through the canyon, noting tracks, scat, and signs of wildlife. There were more prints than I'd expected, a good sign for the survey, but something about their placement felt odd. Clusters of tracks, like the animals had stopped or hesitated in one spot. I brushed it off and kept working. By afternoon, I found myself deep in the canyon, surrounded by cliffs that loomed high above me. It was like standing at the bottom of a stone cathedral. The light didn't seem to reach down here as brightly, and the air was cooler, almost damp. That's when I came across the abandoned camp. A couple of weathered chairs, a rusted tin box, and a fire pit filled with ash long gone cold. Campsites like this weren't unusual in these areas, left behind by hikers or other researchers, but this one felt wrong. The chairs were positioned perfectly, facing each other, as if whoever sat there had just stepped away. No dust, no disruption. The tin box held a few scraps of paper with unintelligible scribbles. Maybe notes, maybe nothing. But there was no food, no signs of life, not even the usual detritus of an old camp. It felt staged, almost deliberate. I took some photos for documentation, telling myself it was just a strange coincidence, and moved on. Still, the unease clung to me like a shadow. That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, howling through the canyon like a living thing. Every creak, every distant rustle felt amplified. Around midnight, I heard something new. A faint crunch of gravel like footsteps. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound was steady, deliberate. My heart thudded in my chest as I counted the steps. 10, 15, then nothing. Silence again, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was just an animal, a coyote, a bobcat maybe, and eventually drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning I noticed something weird. Near my tent, there were footprints, human footprints, and they weren't mine. I crouched down to examine them. The prints were fresh, leading toward my tent before veering off into the desert. They were large, too big to be from any casual hiker I'd seen out here. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe a ranger? But why would a ranger come this far out at night? Maybe another researcher? No, it didn't add up. I decided to shake it off. There was work to do, and overthinking wasn't going to help. Still, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder as I trekked through the canyon that day. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. By mid-afternoon, I was hiking along a narrow ridge when my eyes locked onto a figure ahead. A figure stood in the distance, on a ledge across the canyon. He was motionless, his posture rigid, his clothes dark. He wasn't even moving, just staring at me like some retard. My stomach twisted. I raised a hand to wave, but he didn't respond. He didn't even flinch, for God's sake. The distance made it hard to make out his details, but something about his stillness was deeply unsettling. I turned away, trying to focus on my work, but the urge to look back was overwhelming. When I finally glanced again, he was gone. I hurried back to camp, the unease growing into a gnawing fear. By the time I reached my tent, the sun was setting, and the canyon was cloaked in long, creeping shadows. I forced myself to eat, though the food tasted like dust. My appetite was gone, replaced by the sharp edge of dread. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. They circled my tent, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight and knife, gripping the handle so tightly my fingers ached. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty desert. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the area, searching for movement. And then I saw him. He was standing about 20 feet away, his silhouette stark against the faint moonlight. His face was obscured, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911, but there was no signal. Of course, out here, I was completely cut off. I glanced back at the man, and he took another step. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I couldn't stay. My instincts screamed at me to run. Grabbing my essentials, keys, flashlight, knife, I bolted out of the tent. The cold night air burned my lungs as I sprinted to my truck. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. The sound of my boots crunching against the gravel echoed in the silence, a frantic rhythm of fear. When I reached the truck, I threw myself inside and locked the doors. My hands trembled as I started the engine and flicked on the headlights. The beams illuminated him, now standing just a few yards away. His face was pale, almost ghostly, his eyes hollow and empty. His hands were clenched into fists, and he didn't flinch as the light hit him. It was as if he wasn't even human. I slammed the truck into gear and floored it, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust behind me. My heart raced, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they turned white. The road blurred as I sped through the desert, every shadow a potential figure, every noise a reminder of what I'd left behind. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stumbled into the police station, breathless and shaking. I told them everything, every detail, but their faces were a mix of skepticism and pity. They said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Out there, they said, the desert played tricks on the mind. Shadows became figures, wind became whispers. But I know what I saw. I never went back to that site. The memory of the man's silent stare, his deliberate steps, still haunts me. Out there in the middle of nowhere, I realized just how alone I truly was. And sometimes, I wonder if I was ever alone at all. I've been driving all over the country for years, hitting spots most folks wouldn't even give a second look. There's something kind of comforting about it. Those gas stations with busted neon signs, greasy diners flipping burgers, and lonely rest stops in the middle of nowhere. Feels like stepping into a time capsule, each one a little piece of forgotten America. But last spring, one stop flipped the script for me completely. Man, I still have nightmares about it to this day. I was on a tight schedule, pushing to make it to a meeting 2 states away. The kind of trip where every minute counts and every mile feels like a small victory. I'd been driving for hours when exhaustion hit me like a wave. The landscape outside my windshield blurred, and my eyelids grew heavier with each passing minute. My GPS showed no towns for miles, and I knew I couldn't keep going without some rest. When I saw the faded sign for a rest stop, I felt a mix of relief and unease. The sign was barely readable, the letters chipped and faded by time and weather. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A single arrow pointed down a narrow road, the kind you only see in horror movies. However, it was my only option. The road snaked through dense trees, the shadows growing darker as my headlights struggled to pierce the gloom. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged into a clearing. The rest stop was small, just a parking lot, a single-story building, and a few picnic tables scattered under dim streetlights. The place looked abandoned. The asphalt was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the building's paint was peeling, but the lights inside were on. I parked my car and stepped out, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and mildew. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I approached the building. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and cleaning products. It was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of your own breathing. A man stood behind the counter, his uniform wrinkled and his face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His posture was slouched, like he'd been standing there for decades and had given up trying to make himself presentable. "Need a room?" he asked without looking up. I hesitated, glancing around. "Yeah, just for the night." He slid me a key with a beat-up plastic tag that said room 3. "Down the hall," he muttered, not even looking up. I shrugged, grabbed the key, and immediately noticed how freaking cold his hand was, like way colder than it should have been. It sent a little chill down my spine, but I brushed it off and headed down the hallway. The place was dim as hell, with those crappy fluorescent lights buzzing and flickering like they were about to give up for good. As I walked, I kept catching shadows shifting in the corner of my eye. Every time I whipped around to check, though, there was nothing there. Room 3 was at the very end of the hall. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and I wasn't surprised by what I found inside. The room was small and dingy, a single bed with a thin, scratchy blanket, a nightstand missing one of its legs, and a chair with peeling paint. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing patches of discolored plaster beneath. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, like rust. Too tired to care, I dropped my bag on the chair and sat on the bed. The mattress sagged under my weight, and the springs creaked loudly. I told myself I'd sleep for a few hours, just enough to make the next stretch of the drive bearable. But as I lay there, staring up at the stained ceiling, something felt off. The silence was crushing, thick enough to make me feel like I couldn't breathe. The only noise was the weak hum of the busted air vent rattling now and then, like it was on its last leg. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. My eyes kept darting to the window. The curtains were thin, barely covering anything, and the dim glow from the streetlight outside barely lit up the place. Then I heard it, a low, dragging sound, like claws scraping across wood. I froze. The sound wasn't loud, but it was way too intentional for comfort. My heart started jackhammering in my chest as I sat up, breathing like I'd just run a mile. "Hello," I croaked out, barely loud enough to hear myself. The scraping stopped, dead silent again. But somehow that silence felt worse, heavier, like something was out there, just waiting. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, like someone was testing the glass. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it at the window. The curtain swayed slightly, but I couldn't see what was outside. My palms were clammy as I stood and approached the window. I gripped the edge of the curtain, hesitating for a moment before pulling it aside. There was nothing there. The empty parking lot stretched out before me, bathed in the dim light of the street lamp. I let out a shaky breath and closed the curtain, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a loose branch. But deep down, I knew better. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. My eyes refused to stay closed, darting to every corner of the room. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the building set my nerves on edge. And then the tapping started again. This time it wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was soft but insistent, like someone was gently knocking. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it the man from the counter? Another guest? Or something worse? I grabbed the flashlight again and edged toward the door. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I shined the flashlight at the bottom of the door, but the faint light revealed nothing. No shadows, no movement. Summoning all my courage, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The hallway was empty. The flickering lights cast long, shifting shadows, and the faint hum of electricity buzzed in the air. As I stepped out, the floor creaked under my weight. That's when I saw it, a single wet footprint on the linoleum floor, leading away from my door. The print was muddy, the edges smeared as if whoever had left it was dragging their feet. Panic surged through me. I quickly retreated into the room, locking the door and pushing the chair against it for good measure. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone, only to see the dreaded words, "No service." The hours that followed were a blur of terror and exhaustion. I sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, my eyes darting between the door and the window. Every noise outside felt amplified. Every shadow felt alive. I thought about leaving, about bolting to my car and driving off into the night. But something told me that whatever was out there was waiting for me to do just that. When the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought me to tears. I gathered my things in record time and bolted out of the room, not daring to look back. The lobby was empty. The man from the night before, nowhere to be seen. The desk was abandoned, and the key rack was empty. It was as if no one had been there at all. I practically sprinted to my car, throwing my bag into the passenger seat and slamming the door shut. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the building. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window of room 3, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't let off the gas until I hit the next town, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they were straight up throbbing. I pulled into this little diner and tried to tell the waitress what went down, but the words came out all messed up, like they didn't even feel real. She just nodded, real polite, her face giving nothing away. To this day, I've got no clue what really happened at that rest stop. No idea who or what was messing with my door and window that night. But one thing's for damn sure, I'm never stopping at a place like that again.